She stood quietly outside the courthouse, her fingers wrapped tightly around a simple black folder. The morning air carried the sound of car horns from the street, but her mind was far from the noise. Today was not just another day. Today was a test of patience, of strength, and of everything she had worked for over the years. She knew eyes would be on her, though not for the reasons everyone expected. When she finally stepped through the courthouse doors, the building felt colder than the morning breeze. The marble floors echoed with footsteps, and the low chatter of people waiting for their cases filled the wide hallway. She moved with calm steps, not rushing, not hesitating. Even though her heart beat a little faster than usual, it didn't take long for him to notice her. The officer stood near the front benches of the courtroom, his uniform crisp, his voice loud enough to cut through the low hum of the crowd. He was the kind of man who carried himself with certainty, the kind of certainty that could quickly turn into arrogance. He recognized her the moment she entered. His eyes narrowed and a smirk touched his face, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Well, look who we've got here," he said, his words sharp enough for people nearby to turn their heads. "Back again, huh? You'd think some people would learn their lesson the first time." She stopped in her tracks, not because his words stung, but because she wanted to see how far he would go. She didn't answer. Her silence only seemed to encourage him. "You know," he continued, folding his arms across his chest, "some folks just don't know when to quit. Coming into court like this, wasting everyone's time. I see this all the time. People thinking they can play games with the law." The crowd shifted uneasily. A few people glanced between the woman and the officer, curious about what was happening. Some of them assumed she must be another defendant, perhaps someone trying to fight a ticket or a charge. The officer's tone carried a weight of authority, and for the moment they believed his story. But she did not look like someone afraid of being in trouble. Her posture was steady, her face calm, her eyes clear. She listened to every word, but her expression never changed. She wasn't here to argue. Not yet. The officer, mistaking her quietness for weakness, pressed on. "I remember faces," he said, nodding as if convincing himself. "And I remember yours. You can't fool me. Some people think they're smarter than the system. But the system always wins. Remember that." Her gaze met his for the first time. She didn't raise her voice or let a flicker of anger show. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as though considering whether he was worth answering. But she chose silence again. That silence was heavier than any reply. The people sitting in the benches began to whisper to each other. Who was she? Why wasn't she saying anything back? The officer seemed to thrive under the attention, standing taller, his chest puffed out. "Don't think staying quiet is going to help you," he said firmly. "It never does. Once you're standing in front of the judge, there's no hiding. They'll see right through you." Still, she gave no reaction. She turned her eyes away from him and instead looked at the clerk arranging papers near the bench. The clerk glanced back at her, a quick knowing look passing between them. It was a look that the officer did not notice, but it was enough to make her straighten her shoulders a little more. The officer, sensing he was losing her attention, stepped closer. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Don't act like you're above all this. Everyone here has to answer for their actions, and you're no different." That was when she finally spoke. Her voice soft but clear enough for him to hear. "Are you finished?" The question caught him off guard. He blinked, taken aback that she had finally responded. Her tone wasn't defensive. It wasn't emotional. It was calm, like someone asking a simple question at the end of a conversation. He frowned, his confidence slipping for a moment. "Finished?" "No, I'm just getting started. You think walking in here with that look on your face is going to change anything? Trust me, the judge isn't going to go easy on you. You'll see." She gave a small nod, not agreeing with him but acknowledging his words like one might acknowledge the ramblings of someone who didn't know the full story. Then she walked past him, her step steady, her black folder still in her hand. People in the courtroom followed her with their eyes. A few whispered guesses. Maybe she was a lawyer, maybe she was there to file something important. The officer turned his head, confused by the way she carried herself. Defendants usually looked nervous, guilty, or defensive. But this woman, she looked like she belonged. He shook it off quickly, muttering under his breath, "Doesn't matter. We'll see what happens." The clerk at the bench looked up again as she approached. There was no hesitation in the clerk's movements now. With a respectful nod, the clerk gestured for her to wait near the side door, the one that led directly to the chambers. That was when the first ripple of surprise passed through the room. Defendants didn't go through that door. Neither did lawyers. That door was reserved for only one person. The officer frowned, watching as she stepped aside, standing near the door with the same calmness she had shown from the start. He tried to brush off the unease rising in his chest. Maybe she was just some clerk or assistant. Maybe. But something about the way the real clerk had treated her didn't fit that guess. The chatter in the courtroom grew louder. People leaned toward one another, whispering questions they couldn't answer. The officer tapped his foot impatiently, but inside a small crack had appeared in his confidence. She stood quietly, letting the noise fade into the background. For her, this wasn't about proving the officer wrong. It wasn't about winning an argument or showing off. She had learned long ago that truth revealed itself in time, and today was no different. The bailiff entered and called the court to order. The crowd quickly settled down, the whispers dying into silence. Everyone turned toward the bench, waiting for the session to begin. The officer adjusted his uniform, ready to play his part. He still believed the woman was there to stand before the judge. He still believed he had the upper hand, but as the side door opened and the clerk gave her a small nod, she took one slow, steady breath. The time for silence was nearly over, and in that moment, standing at the threshold of the next room, she knew the entire courtroom was about to see her in a way they never expected. The room was filled with the low hum of restless whispers. People shifted in their seats, looking toward the front, trying to make sense of what they had just seen. The officer stood stiffly, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between the woman and the side door she now waited near. He told himself it was nothing, that she must have been a clerk or someone delivering papers. Still, the image of her calm eyes and steady steps kept nagging at him. Something about her didn't fit into the picture he had drawn in his mind. The bailiff's deep voice silenced the chatter. "All rise," he called out. Chairs scraped against the floor as everyone quickly stood. The officer straightened his uniform, ready to face the judge. He had done this countless times before. It was routine. But today, routine was about to be broken. The door opened slowly, and she stepped through. The soft sound of her shoes against the polished wood carried through the silence. Every eye followed her as she moved past the side table, her black folder now resting against her side. Her steps were unhurried, yet filled with a kind of quiet strength. She walked straight to the bench, climbed the small steps, and without a flicker of doubt, she took her seat. For a few seconds, the room stayed completely silent. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the world itself had paused to make sure everyone understood what had just happened. The officer blinked, confusion spreading across his face. His arms, that had been crossed with confidence earlier, now hung loosely at his sides. The whispers began again, but this time they weren't soft. They rippled through the courtroom like a wave. "She's the judge," someone gasped. Another voice followed. "I thought she was here for a case." People leaned toward each other, wide-eyed, trying to confirm what their eyes were showing them. The officer felt his stomach drop. He remembered every word he had spoken to her just minutes ago, every assumption he had made. His voice echoed in his mind, "You can't fool me. The judge will see right through you." And now here she was, seated in the very chair he had spoken of, her gaze level and unshaken. She lifted the gavel gently, not striking it yet, but holding it in her hand as if to remind everyone that this was her place, her role, her authority. Then, with calm precision, she looked across the room, her eyes resting briefly on each person before finally meeting the officers. Her voice was steady, carrying across the courtroom. "You may be seated." The benches creaked as people lowered themselves back into their seats, the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. The officer sat down as well, but his posture was no longer proud. It was stiff, uncertain. He avoided her eyes, yet he could still feel them on him, a quiet reminder of his mistake. The clerk began reading the first case, and the rhythm of the courtroom returned, but the atmosphere had shifted. The people who had thought she was just another defendant now sat straighter, their respect sharpened by surprise. They watched her every move, the way she listened carefully, the way her words carried authority without force. The officer, however, could barely focus. His thoughts tangled in the memory of what he had said. He remembered the smirk on his face, the way he had spoken down to her as though she was beneath him. He had built his entire impression of her on assumptions, and in less than a minute those assumptions had shattered in front of everyone. She continued through the early cases with calm professionalism. Each defendant that stood before her received the same measured attention, the same respect. She didn't rush them, didn't speak down to them. She listened, asked questions, and made decisions that were firm but fair. As the minutes stretched on, people in the courtroom began to forget the shock of her entrance and instead focused on her work. But the officer couldn't forget. The image of her silence earlier haunted him now. It wasn't silence born from fear, he realized. It had been the silence of someone who knew the truth and didn't need to defend themselves. That silence now seemed louder than anything he had said. His mind raced back to all the times he had walked into courtrooms, certain of his place, certain of his authority. He had stood tall in his uniform, believing it gave him the right to speak however he wished. And most of the time, people never challenged him. They nodded, stayed quiet, or looked away. But today, someone had challenged him without saying a single harsh word. At one point, she glanced at him again. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't even a stern look. It was steady, calm, almost kind. That made it worse somehow, because it wasn't the look of someone seeking revenge. It was the look of someone who had already risen above the situation. The whispers in the courtroom hadn't fully died. A man sitting in the second row leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered, "Did you see how that officer talked to her earlier? Can you believe it?" The woman nodded, her eyes wide. He had no idea. Imagine the embarrassment. The officer heard the whispers. His ears burned, his throat dry. For the first time in a long while, he felt the sting of being small, of being seen for his mistakes. The session carried on, but his focus remained scattered. He watched her handle each case, the way people respected her, the way her words carried weight without needing to be loud. He realized she didn't need to raise her voice or throw her position in anyone's face. She had authority because she had earned it, and because she carried it with grace. As the cases wound down, she closed one file and set it aside, pausing for a moment before moving on. The pause was brief, but long enough for her eyes to lift once more in his direction. Their eyes met, and he felt as though she could see straight through him, past his uniform, past his pride, down to the part of him that was now quietly ashamed. She didn't say anything, but in that look was a message he couldn't ignore. It wasn't anger, it wasn't triumph. It was a reminder, soft but powerful. Respect is given to everyone, no matter who they are, no matter what you assume about them. The rest of the courtroom couldn't stop talking once the session ended. People gathered in small groups near the doors, shaking their heads in disbelief, retelling the story in their own words. The story of the officer who had confronted the judge before realizing who she was spread quickly, like a spark catching in dry grass. The officer didn't join in the chatter. He kept his head down, walking slowly toward the exit. Every step felt heavier than the last. The memory of his words replayed again and again, reminding him how quickly he had judged, how quickly he had spoken without thinking. She, meanwhile, remained at the bench, finishing her notes with the same calmness she had carried since she entered. There was no sign of pride or smugness in her expression. To her, this was not about proving a point. It was simply another day, another reminder that life has a way of flipping the script when people least expect it. For the officer, though, it was a day he would never forget. He had come into the courtroom certain of himself, certain of his role, but he walked out quieter, humbled, carrying with him a lesson that would stay far longer than the echo of his own voice. And though she never raised her voice, never confronted him directly, her presence alone had left an imprint on everyone in that room, especially him. The moment had passed, but the story had only just begun to travel beyond the walls of that courthouse. The courthouse was almost quiet again after the session ended. People filed out in small groups, still whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. The surprise on their faces lingered even as they stepped into the hallway. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled as though they had witnessed a story they would later retell at home. Inside, she remained seated for a few minutes, carefully closing her folder and stacking her papers. The bench looked large, heavy, a symbol of responsibility, but she sat there with calm ease, as if it had been built for her long before this day. Her hands moved gracefully, not rushed, not careless. To her, every detail mattered, every paper, every decision, every moment. The officer lingered at the back, unable to leave just yet. He watched her, his chest still tight with the weight of embarrassment. He wanted to look away, but something kept his eyes on her. It wasn't just guilt. It was something deeper, something harder to put into words. For years, he had thought of himself as the one who upheld respect in the courtroom. He had believed his badge, his uniform, his presence carried all the authority he needed. And yet, in a matter of minutes, she had shown him that real authority wasn't about what you wore, but about how you carried yourself. The bailiff announced a short recess before the next round of hearings. The room emptied further until only a few people remained. The officer shifted uncomfortably, wondering if he should approach her, wondering what he could possibly say. Apologies had never come easy to him, especially not in situations where his pride had already been cracked wide open. She stood then, gathering her folder, and walking down the small steps from the bench. Her pace was steady, her shoulders squared. As she passed by the clerk's desk, she exchanged a quiet word with the clerk, her voice calm but firm. Then she turned slightly, her eyes briefly meeting the officers across the nearly empty room. For a second, the air seemed to tighten again. She didn't frown. She didn't smile either. She simply looked at him in a way that seemed to acknowledge everything without needing words. Then she turned and walked through the side door leading to her chambers. The officer exhaled slowly, realizing he had been holding his breath. He dropped his gaze to the floor, his thoughts loud in the silence. In the hallway, the whispers had grown louder. People gathered in clusters, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others laughing quietly at the irony of it all. The story was already spreading beyond the walls. A man in a suit muttered to another, "He really didn't know who she was, can you believe that?" The other replied, "He talked to her like she was nothing." Imagine the shock when she took the bench. The officer pushed past them without a word. Their voices stung because they carried the truth. He stepped outside into the crisp air. The courthouse steps stretched before him, and he sat down on one of them, resting his elbows on his knees. He ran a hand over his face, trying to steady the storm of thoughts. His pride had taken a blow, but it was more than that. He felt as if a mirror had been held up to him, showing him something he had avoided seeing for years. Meanwhile, inside her chambers, she set her folder on the desk and removed her robe, draping it carefully over the chair. The room was quiet, the walls lined with books, the shelves filled with years of cases and laws. She sat down and let out a small breath, though her expression remained calm. She wasn't shaken by what had happened. She had seen arrogance before, seen the way people underestimated others, judged them by appearance or assumption. What struck her more was the way the courtroom itself had reacted, the way whispers had grown and rippled. She knew that moments like this carried lessons, not just for one person but for everyone watching. The officer sat outside longer than he intended. He didn't know what to do next. A part of him wanted to leave and forget the entire morning. Another part told him that running from it wouldn't make the weight disappear. He had faced confrontations on the street and traffic stops and heated arguments, but this was different. This wasn't about enforcing the law. This was about facing himself. When he finally walked back in, the hallway had quieted. Most people had gone for lunch or stepped outside. The buzz of the earlier chatter had faded, leaving a stillness in the air. He stood there, unsure if he should go back into the courtroom or wait. The clerk walked past him, carrying a stack of files. The clerk gave him a look, not harsh, not mocking, but one that seemed to say, "You know what you need to do." The officer swallowed hard. He wasn't used to feeling small. He wasn't used to being the one in the wrong. But he knew that if he left without saying something, the weight would stay with him far longer. Later, when the session resumed, the officer returned to the courtroom with the others. The benches filled again, though the energy had shifted. Everyone seemed to sit a little straighter, more attentive. They had seen the power of a single moment, and it had humbled them too. She entered again, her robe flowing slightly as she walked. Once more the room rose. She took her seat with the same calm authority as before. The gavel struck and the sound echoed, pulling everyone's attention to her. The cases resumed. Each person who stood before her was treated with dignity, no matter how small or large their case seemed. She listened. She spoke. She made decisions that carried fairness like a steady current. The officer watched, each moment pressing the truth deeper into him. At one point, he caught her eyes again. It was only for a second, but it was enough. He could see there was no anger there. No grudge, just clarity. That look carried more weight than any lecture ever could. As the afternoon wore on, the officer felt his chest grow heavier with the realization that the lesson wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had seen it. Respect wasn't something to demand. It wasn't something you wore on a badge or stitched onto a uniform. It was something you gave freely to every person, because you never truly knew who they were or what they carried. When the session finally ended, the courtroom emptied again. The officer stayed back, waiting. His hands fidgeted slightly, a rare sign of nervousness. When she stepped down from the bench, he took a slow breath and walked forward. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the quiet room. He searched for the right words, but none came easily. His throat felt dry. Finally, in a voice lower than usual, he said, "I spoke out of turn earlier." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "I shouldn't have made assumptions," he added, his voice tight, but honest. "I was wrong." There was a pause. Then she nodded, her eyes softening slightly. "We all learn, sometimes in ways we don't expect." Her words were simple, but they struck him deeply. She didn't scold him. She didn't humiliate him. She left the space open for him to carry the lesson himself. He nodded back, his chest heavy but a little lighter than before. He knew those words would follow him long after he walked out of that building. And as he left the courthouse that day, the whispers still alive in the hallways, he realized the story wasn't just about him or her. It was about everyone who had been in that room, everyone who had seen how quickly the roles could shift. It was about the truth that respect is never wasted, but disrespect always leaves a mark. That day would be told again and again, not as a story of shame, but as a story of change. The next morning, the courthouse looked the same as it always did. The same tall doors, the same wide marble floor, the same rows of benches where people waited nervously for their names to be called. Yet for those who had been present the day before, something about the place felt different. The memory of what happened still lingered in the air, like an invisible weight that no one could quite ignore. Word had spread quickly. Stories traveled fast in places like this, carried from one person to another, sometimes changed a little along the way, but always carrying the same core truth. A police officer had spoken down to a woman he believed was just another defendant, only to watch her take the judge's seat minutes later. Some people retold the story with laughter, others with a kind of awe, but all agreed it was something they would never forget. The officer walked into the courthouse again that morning. His steps were slower than usual, his eyes not as sharp. He had spent much of the night replaying the moment over and over in his mind. He thought about his words, his tone, the way he had looked at her before he knew who she was. No matter how many times he tried to push it aside, the truth came back to him. He had been wrong. Not wrong about the facts of a case or a detail on a report, but wrong about a person. This time, when he entered the courtroom, he kept his voice low. He greeted a few familiar faces but didn't linger. His usual confidence was still there, but it had softened. He had come to understand something he hadn't before. That respect wasn't just part of his job, it was part of being human. Inside, she was already seated at the bench. Her robe fell neatly around her shoulders, her black folder resting in front of her. She had arrived early, as she always did, taking time to prepare, to go over each case with care. For her, every detail mattered because behind every file was a person, and every person deserved to be seen. The bailiff called the room to order, and the session began. The officer sat quietly watching her work. It was not the first time he had seen a judge in action, but this time he noticed things he hadn't before. The way she leaned forward slightly when someone spoke, showing she was listening. The way she paused before giving a decision, not rushing, not dismissing. The way her words carried weight without needing to be harsh. At one point, a young man stood before her, clearly nervous, his hands shaking as he held onto the edge of the table. His voice cracked as he tried to explain himself. The officer, who might have dismissed him quickly before, now watched closely. He saw the way she spoke to the young man, not to scold, not to shame, but to steady him. Her questions were direct, but her tone carried understanding. By the time she gave her decision, the young man's shoulders had eased, his voice steadier. The officer felt something shift inside him. He had always believed his role was about control, about showing strength, but now he saw another kind of strength. The strength to listen, the strength to hold authority without crushing someone beneath it. The courtroom moved from one case to another, each moment another thread woven into the fabric of the day. People came in anxious and left with answers. sometimes heavy, sometimes light, but always with the sense that they had been heard. During a short break, she stepped down from the bench and moved toward her chambers. The officer hesitated, then followed her with his eyes. He wasn't sure if he would ever have the courage to speak to her again, but the lesson she had given him without even trying was already working its way through him. He remembered the look she had given him the day before, not angry, not mocking, but steady, calm, even kind. That look had told him more than words ever could. It had reminded him that his role did not place him above anyone. It was simply one piece of a larger system, and every piece mattered. Back in the courtroom, people whispered again. This time the whispers were different. They weren't about surprise or shock. They were about respect. A woman leaned toward the man beside her and said, "She treats everyone the same. Doesn't matter who you are, she listens." The man nodded, his voice low but firm. That's real power. Not raising your voice, not needing to prove yourself. Just doing the work. The officer heard their words and felt a quiet agreement inside him. He had worn a uniform for years, thinking it gave him all the respect he needed. But now he understood that respect wasn't something you put on in the morning. It was something you built moment by moment in the way you treated others. When the afternoon session began, a woman came forward with a complicated case. Her story was long, filled with details that made the room restless. A few people sighed, others glanced at the clock, but the judge listened patiently, not cutting her off. She asked questions when needed, took notes carefully, and never once let her expression show frustration. The officer found himself watching not just the case, but the way the judge carried herself. He thought about how easy it would have been for her to treat people the way he had treated her, to use her position to put him in his place. Instead, she had chosen patience, fairness, and dignity. The realization struck him deeply. Authority used without respect only creates fear. Authority used with respect creates change. By the time the final case ended and the gavel struck for the last time that day, the officer felt as though he had lived through a week instead of a few hours. He stayed seated as others left, waiting until the room had nearly emptied. When she finally stood and gathered her folder, he rose too. He didn't rush forward this time. He simply nodded once, a gesture of respect, quiet but meaningful. She returned the nod, her expression calm, her eyes holding that same steady clarity. It was a small exchange, but it carried more weight than any words could. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. The officer stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air. He thought about all the times he had walked those steps with pride, never questioning his own assumptions. Today he walked them differently. He walked them slower, with more thought, carrying a lesson he knew he would never forget. People passing by still whispered about what had happened the day before. The story was already becoming something bigger than the moment itself. It was being told as a reminder, a warning, and a lesson. Some told it with humor, others with seriousness, but always with the same message. Respect people because you never know who they really are or what they carry. For the officer, that message was personal now. It wasn't just a story he had heard. It was a story he had lived, and he knew it would stay with him, shaping not just how he worked, but how he lived. Inside her chambers, she placed her robe neatly on its hanger and closed her folder for the day. She sat for a moment in the quiet room, letting the stillness settle around her. She wasn't thinking about the whispers or the way the story was spreading. She was thinking about the work, about the cases still ahead, about the people who would come into her courtroom tomorrow. She knew that respect wasn't something shown once and forgotten. It was something you carried with you every day, in every decision, in every word. And she intended to keep carrying it, no matter how many people whispered, no matter how many stories were told. For her, it wasn't about teaching lessons or proving points. It was about doing what was right, again and again, until it became part of the world around her. And for those who had witnessed it, especially the officer, it was a reminder they would carry forward too. The following days at the courthouse were calmer on the surface, but underneath, something had changed. People still came in and out. Cases were still called one after another, and the same wooden benches creaked as people shifted nervously while waiting. But there was now a kind of quiet awareness among those who had seen the earlier scene. The officer was one of them. Each morning when he walked through the courthouse doors, he no longer carried the same sharp edge in his stride. He still stood tall, still did his work, but now there was thoughtfulness in his eyes that had not been there before. He noticed more. The way a mother clutched her child's hand before stepping forward. The way an old man shuffled slowly but tried to stand straight when his name was called. The way younger people spoke too fast because they were nervous and trying not to make mistakes. He noticed these things because he remembered how quickly he had judged the woman in the robe, and he knew he had judged others the same way before. Now, instead of brushing past them, he slowed down, gave a nod, or softened his tone. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The judge continued her work as though nothing unusual had happened. She didn't change her manner, didn't bring up the story that everyone else still whispered about. To her, each case deserved the same attention, whether or not people were still talking about her moment with the officer. But those who watched closely could see the strength of her presence more clearly now. One afternoon, a particularly difficult case came up. A young boy, barely out of his teenage years, stood trembling before the bench. His mother sat behind him, eyes red from crying, while a file thick with papers lay open on the desk. His mistake was serious, but his future still hung in the balance. The room felt tense, filled with the weight of decisions that could change a life. The officer, standing at his usual place, found himself holding his breath. Before, he might have looked at the boy and assumed the worst. But now he waited, watching the judge. She spoke gently but directly. She asked the boy questions, not just about what he had done, but about who he was outside of that moment, what he hoped to do, what he understood about his mistake. The boy's voice cracked, but he answered honestly. He spoke about fear, about regret, about wanting another chance. His words were simple, but they carried truth. When she gave her decision, it wasn't with softness alone, nor with harshness. It was balanced, a choice that held him accountable, but also gave him room to rebuild. The mother broke down in quiet relief, whispering thank you over and over. The officer stood there, moved in a way he couldn't easily explain. It wasn't the decision itself, but the way it had been reached, with care, with fairness, with respect. He knew that if he had been the one standing before her that first day, she would have given him that same fairness, no matter what role he played. Later, outside the courtroom, the officer sat on the steps for a while, watching people pass by. Some left smiling, others left heavy with worry. But all had faced the same process, the same judge. He thought about how often people came here feeling small, frightened, or overlooked. And he thought about how one person, with the right approach, could make them feel seen. The whispers about the judge hadn't gone away. In fact, they were spreading beyond the courthouse now. People who had never set foot inside still repeated the story, each adding their own spin. Some laughed about the irony of it, others shared it as a lesson, but all seemed drawn to it. The officer overheard two people talking in a cafe one evening. They spoke about how you never know who someone is or what they've been through. One of them said, "That's why you treat everyone with respect. Because titles and uniforms come and go, but dignity is something deeper." The officer sipped his coffee quietly, knowing those words had never meant more to him. Back in the courthouse, the days rolled on, each filled with new faces and new decisions. Yet for the officer, every day felt like another chance to practice what he had learned. He held doors open more often. He gave clear directions instead of short-clipped answers. He reminded himself again and again that behind every nervous face was a story he couldn't see. One morning, as he walked the halls, he passed a group of young recruits who were just starting their training. He heard one of them speaking with the same tone he had once used, sharp, dismissive, quick to judge. The officer paused, watching them for a moment. He could have walked on, but instead he stepped closer. He didn't lecture them. He didn't raise his voice. He simply told them a short version of what had happened in the courtroom that day, leaving out names and details. "Respect isn't just about following rules," he said. "It's about how you carry yourself, even when you think no one is watching. Because one day you'll find out that everyone is watching and it will matter." The recruits nodded, some more thoughtfully than others. He didn't expect the lesson to sink in all at once, but he knew it had been planted, just as it had been planted in him. The judge, meanwhile, continued her work in her steady way. She didn't seek the attention her story had brought. In fact, she seemed unaware of how far it had spread. To her, the courthouse wasn't a stage. It was a place of responsibility. Her focus was always on the next case, the next person who would walk in and stand before her. But those around her noticed. The clerks, the lawyers, even the visitors sitting on the benches. They all saw the way she listened, the way she spoke, the way she gave dignity to each person. And little by little it influenced them too. One lawyer, known for speaking harshly to defendants, began to soften his tone. A clerk who often rushed people through paperwork started to explain things more patiently. Even the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, becoming less about fear and more about fairness. And through it all, the officer kept learning. Not in a classroom, not from a textbook, but from moments, from watching her work, from hearing the way others spoke about respect, from feeling the weight of his own mistake and the lesson it had given him. Weeks later, the courthouse felt different to him. The marble floor was the same. The tall doors were the same. The long wooden benches were the same. But for him, everything had changed. Because now he walked those halls not just as an officer, but as someone who understood the power of respect. And every time his eyes met hers across the room, he remembered the moment it all began. A moment he would never forget. A moment that continued to ripple outward, touching not just him, but everyone who heard the story. It wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It was about what came after, the growth, the change, the way a single moment could reshape the way people saw the world. And as the officer stood watch one more afternoon, he felt a quiet gratitude inside him. Gratitude for the lesson, for the chance to change, and for the reminder that no matter where you stand, in uniform, in a robe, or on the other side of the bench, we all share the same need to be treated with dignity. That was the heart of it. That was what he carried forward, and that was the story people would keep telling, long after the moment had passed.